I try to reason with religious believers all the time, though they can never, and I mean this, ever defend their beliefs. But they won't give up or admit defeat either, because the belief is the most important thing, even more than truth. Truth, it seems, is irrelevant to what they want to believe. Instead, they deflect to the next level or straight to their final boss. They advise that I should listen to serious theologians and celebrated professional apologists like William Lane Craig, for example. And if you're already laughing at that, understand that Craig is one that believers most often refer me to as if he's the best they got. And if that's true, I have to wonder why there are still believers. And Craig is not the only one, but whoever I'm referred to listen to, and whenever I do listen to one of these people making their arguments from whatever field of study, they always turn out to know less about that topic than I do. They're always saying stupid things that the experts in that field would criticize as misrepresented or in other ways wrong. For example, someone recently referred me to a presentation by Irish Catholic apologist John Lennox, who, for whatever reason I can't understand, is someone whom a lot of theists admire or respect. But I can't imagine why after having heard him. While watching this video, I recognized some people I knew in the audience, and I called one of them to learn that this event turned out to be in Oxford back in 2012.
I believe in God.
I'm sorry to hear that, but I know a support group that can help you. I would call this a failure of the education system, but Lennox is old and Irish. And this is what the Catholic-controlled education system of Ireland in his day meant to do. So it's not a failure. It was all a part of their fiendish plan.
I believe in the supernatural God who created the heavens and the earth.
If you believe in the supernatural, then you believe in magic. That's literally what that means. Miraculous magic and magical miracles have essentially the same definition in several dictionaries. They are the same thing. I think it would be inappropriately polite for me to pretend as if supernatural miracles were not magic. The Bible is full of magic. Blessings and curses are both magical enchantments. Adam was created by a golem spell. God spoke everything out of nothing with an incantation. There's an elemental spell detailed in Leviticus 14, and an enchanted potion in Numbers 5, necromancy and an army of the undead in Ezekiel 37, as well as faith healing and prophesying, transformation, transfiguration, levitation, and even water bending. The Bible and the Quran are both full of magical things. But the only reason people believe in magic is because it isn't real. If magic was real, you wouldn't have to make believe. There would be people like Gandalf, Spock, Obi-Wan, and Hermione who could demonstrate their powers repeatedly and reliably so that even if science couldn't explain it, we'd at least have to admit that there's something there that is unexplained. But there isn't anything there. No one can verify that there was any truth to any of that whatsoever.
I believe in a God who holds the heavens and the earth in existence.
His a priori assertion that the existence of objective reality depends on his subjective fantasy is a baseless, unwarranted, and erroneous assumption. Think about this for a moment. The reason the Bible speaks of the heavens and the earth is because the ignorant primitives who wrote these fables came from a terrestrial perspective, imagining that the entirety of the cosmos was somehow of comparable size to the earth. They thought that the earth was huge and unmoving, and that all of space was just a shell, spinning slowly a short distance above and around the earth. They thought that the stars were all in fixed positions in this mythical firmament, which also contained the sun and the moon, as if they ran on invisible tracks across the sky. The people, these authors of these old fables, had no idea of the actual vastness of space compared to this one tiny speck of dust on which we live. Instead, the authors of the fable of creation imagined that Earth was the biggest thing in the center of the universe, and that everything else, including the sun and the moon and all the stars, were smaller than the Earth, and that they orbited around the Earth, and that they thought that the only thing bigger than the Earth was the firmament, the solid crystalline dome that covers and contains the Earth, and that really doesn't even exist.
I believe that on the basis of rational evidence.
No, you don't. Rational means in accordance with reason or logic, but the belief in God is neither. I've already heard the nonsense excuse that you give for this later, and it is neither logical nor reasoned. We'll get into that in a later video. For now, understand that there is no actual factual evidence of a God, nor logically valid arguments for it either, but plenty of both against.
Similar to the beliefs held by the founders of this house, who gave this university the motto, Dominus Illuminatio Mea. They saw no contradiction between faith in God and the utmost excellence in rational inquiry.
That motto was given way back in the 1500s, at the end of the Renaissance, but another century before the beginning of the Enlightenment and long before the beginning of the scientific revolution. Far and away from the utmost excellence in rational inquiry. No, they were still burning witches back then. The motto of Oxford University means, God is my light, which seems to be in stark contrast with the motto of the city of Oxford, which means, strong is the truth.
And if I dare mention my alma mater of Cambridge in this holy place, I would remind you that on the door of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge are written the words, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them."
Yes, the question-begging fallacy, assuming your own conclusions without question, is ubiquitous throughout all religions, and religious people do tend to pee on everything of value like that in an attempt to mark it all as theirs, even when it has nothing to do with their faith or even contradicts it.
And as we look at the rise of science in the 16th and 17th centuries, Alfred North Whitehead and many others commented that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver.
Yet Carl Sagan spoke of some ancient Ionians as the pioneers of what would eventually be renewed as science. They existed long before Christianity, before most of the books of the Bible, even before the book of Genesis. They knew that gods are typically described as capricious, and that a world with gods was consequently unpredictable and thus unintelligible. But a natural world would be one that has to adhere to properties and attributes and limits that do not change. Thus, only a world without gods could be properly understood.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject.
Conversely, Christianity has famously done all that it could to reject, deny, and oppose science. Religious fundamentalism has stoically impeded, retarded, or reversed progress in every application it has ever touched. That's why modern believers have to learn moderation, to find some way to drag their primitive belief systems kicking and screaming into the modern times.
What I am amazed at is that serious thinkers today continue to ask us to choose between God and science. That's like asking people to choose between Henry Ford and engineering as an explanation of the motor car.
Ford didn't invent or engineer the motor car. He invented the factory assembly line. So that was a bad analogy, but there isn't a good one. And no one is asking anyone to choose between God and science, although they might have to choose between the supernatural, meaning magic, and naturalism, meaning without magic. Because if you're a serious thinker, then you'd have to realize that you don't really know anything if you have to believe it on faith. You only really know to be true what you can show to be true. Thus, you need testable, potentially falsifiable theories based on objectively verifiable facts and evidence. Miracles can never be considered, and not just because they're never indicated, but because even suggesting them means admitting that you just want to blame magic whenever you don't know what the real answer is.
When Newton discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, I've got a law, I don't need God. No, he wrote the Principia Mathematica, arguably the greatest work in the whole history of science.
No. The Principia Mathematica was written by the aforementioned Alfred North Whitehead and the atheist Bertrand Russell. You're thinking of Newton's book on the natural philosophy of the principles of mathematics.
Because he saw that God is not the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation.
Because a scientific explanation is an explanation. Whereas gods and magic allegedly explain everything but don't really explain anything. They're just excuses for when you don't know or care what the real explanation is.
God doesn't compete.
Nor can he. There's a reason why Jesus said, "Thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test." because God cannot withstand critical scrutiny. In other words, God cannot compete. Try any experiment you like and he'll fail. Like, for example, if we have 100 or so kids with different diseases, divide them into two comparable groups, some with leukemia, pneumonia, and diabetes in that group, matched with leukemia, pneumonia, and diabetes in this other group, and take one group to a hospital with no chaplains, and take another group to faith healers with no medical training. And then we'll see how well God competes with science. Or, even better, take two groups of kids where you don't know what's wrong with any of them, and then drop one group off with a faith healer, not just for treatment, but for diagnosis, too. Want to place bets on how badly God would do in that competition?
Agency does not compete with mechanism and law.
God doesn't compete with law. Instead, believers say that he defies the law, especially the laws of physics, because everything God allegedly does is physically impossible. And believers say that God is above the law whenever they want to justify some atrocity done in his name. Every law, even those wrongly attributed to God, were all established by men. We have no God-given rights. All our rights are granted by human legislators and can be denied at the whim of men, too. God was never a lawgiver. God doesn't have agency. He knows everything his believers do and only what they do, nothing more than that. He hates all the same people and things that his believers do, and for the same reasons, of course. God can't do anything either, which is why people pretend to do all of God's work for him, because he can't do anything for himself. People are both the agents of God and the mechanism of God, and they write the laws for God. God has nothing, hears nothing, knows nothing, does nothing, and is nothing without make-believers pretending for him.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
Because, as I understand it, there could never be absolutely nothing, not in any reality where anything might exist, because even empty space requires existence.
Alan Sandage, the brilliant cosmologist who became a Christian in his 50s, said God is the answer to that question.
Then apparently Alan Sandage was a brilliant cosmologist until he became a Christian in his 50s, because God was never the answer to that question. If there was ever nothing, then there wouldn't be a God either. If God exists outside of this reality, then he does not exist in reality. Believers won't admit that because that's logic, which is opposed to religious belief. Those who try to rationalize God's divine hiddenness by saying that he exists outside of this reality have to at least accept that this is a reality. Therefore, the natural cosmos is not nothing, and the supernatural cosmos, in which this mythical deity allegedly resides, is not nothing either. So it is conceivably possible that if a God could exist in a supernatural realm beyond the bounds of physical reality, then it is also possible that such an uber-cosmic reality might still exist even if God did not exist there. So God is not required for this reality nor for any other either. If we stay within the bounds of the natural universe, then we could call that nothing only if it's empty. But it isn't, and it never was. Every model of cosmogony I know of has something in it. Even if we go back to the Big Bang, we still have a singularity, which is timeless and eternal, being as it already existed before the beginning of time. Or, I've heard some physicists argue that the singularity might be a remnant of a prior form of the universe, perhaps one where the arrow of entropy points the other way. Either way, the singularity is not nothing. Instead, it's literally everything. I hope it's not too obvious already that this isn't my field, but then Lennox doesn't know it either. As I understand it, the singularity is a hot, dense compression of all material energy as well as space and time all into a single unit. Religious apologists typically imagine a big empty space with this one tiny thing in it that then blows up. But that tiny thing is the entirety of everything, including space-time. So there is no empty space. There is only that thing. It's space itself that is inflating, not some speck out in space. So instead of a void with one thing in it, you can't avoid the thing because everything is in it. That's how I understand it, anyway. And not that I really know. This is not something I study, because whether the universe had a beginning or not is irrelevant to anything I do study, and it wouldn't change anything either way. So I don't know or care about cosmogony. Well, apparently I at least know more about it than Lennox does.
But people are now so desperate to show that the universe created itself from nothing, which seems to me to be an immediate oxymoron.
I don't think anyone is desperate to show what no one even believes. When a scientist says something that to you sounds stupid, it might be that you yourself are stupid. After all, science is hard to understand and easy to get wrong. You should consider that maybe the smart people who study this for a living might have a better understanding of it than you do, especially since you obviously never studied this at all and cannot even explain it correctly. Though I notice that often people will not extend that courtesy to scientists like they will with theologians. When a theologian says something that sounds stupid, then folks usually do assume that he knows more about whatever it is than they do. But my experience has increasingly been that if a theologian says something stupid, it's because they really are stupid. At least in that they know less about the subject than I do, or more often, they don't know what they're talking about at all and are just talking out of their asses.
If I say X created Y, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. If I say X created X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X, which simply shows that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists utter it.
Except that high-powered scientists don't utter that. No one ever said the universe created itself. Instead, I hear physicists saying that the universe was never created at all.
It reminds me a little bit of G.K. Chesterton, who said, "It is absurd to complain that it is unthinkable for an unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, and then to pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything."
I don't think any physicist believes the universe came from nothing. Not even Lawrence Krauss believes that. Instead, they say that in some sense the universe has always existed. Cosmologist John Carroll put it this way.
In my favorite cosmological model, which again is always subject to updating when new ideas or data come in, the universe doesn't have a beginning. It does not come into existence at a moment in time. It always existed. It looks different from moment to moment. And we are only observing a tiny part of it, so we don't even know what the whole thing looks like. But there's no need for an explanation to cause a beginning, something coming to existence out of nothing.
The heavens declare the glory of God, says the ancient psalm.
Yeah, but that's just one more thing the Bible is wrong about. This poll proves it, noting that only 7.5% of physicists and astronomers believe in God. Scientists in general are much more atheist than the laity. The more you know, the less you believe. So the more educated you are, the less likely you are to believe. The highest percentage of believers were 14.3% of mathematicians. Lennox is a mathematician. All the physical sciences scored lower than that. The only stat with a lower percentage of believers than physicists and astronomers were biologists at a mere 5.5%. These are the folks who understand evolution. In this article, Sean Carroll explains why almost all cosmologists are atheists. Since the fact is that the more you study the heavens, the more likely you are to reject God, then it turns out that the heavens do not declare the glory of God. Instead, they make obvious his absence.
And we've unraveled a bit of that, seeing the fine-tuning of the fundamental forces of nature. It's something that's so striking to scientists that it demands explanation.
I have already seen that explanation provided by scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson and the aforementioned Sean Carroll and particle physicist Victor Stenger, who is a friend of mine. All of them expertly refute the fine-tuning argument, and I'll put those links below. All of them show how the people who talk about fine-tuning as if it's real and somehow indicative of a God have not really given this much serious thought. To illustrate that, I myself did a 20-minute video on my own, I think, unique take on how indefensibly stupid the fine-tuning argument is. I'll link to that too, but here's a short clip. Believers imagine the universe as if it was perfectly ordered with clockwork precision, whereas I see it as a boiling chaos, where the best we can hope for is the appearance of a temporary balance, and that it only looks serene because we're watching it in really slow motion. So slow that some of the more catastrophic aspects of cosmic chaos look as placid as a Bob Ross painting, in which there might be a happy little nebula here or there, not because a sun exploded there, but because the resultant clouds are colorful and pretty. And go ahead and ask why the universe in which we live happens to be the one in which we can live. And while you're at it, you could ask the same question about the Earth. Why is our world optimal for producing life? A better question would be, why is the entire rest of the cosmos that we can see so brutally hostile to life? Clearly, the universe was not fine-tuned for life, because we would die instantly everywhere else and can only survive temporarily on a fraction of the skin of this one tiny mote of dust across a seemingly endless void of death.
And it seems to me that Arno Penzias hit it right. He is the Nobel Prize winner who discovered the microwave background on which a lot of the evidence for the Big Bang is based. He said astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan.
Of course, the Bible-believing creationist Arno Penzias would be the one to say that the universe was created out of nothing, because that's what creationists believe. Creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. That God essentially said abracadabra and thus spoke everything out of nothing. And the fact that the Bible gets every detail wrong, such that Scripture doesn't match, account for, nor even relate to the Big Bang theory, stellar nucleosynthetic theory, nebular theory, accretion theory, nor evolution either, simply goes unnoticed, being deliberately ignored by those who profess to believe in Genesis.
But I want to come to what I think is one of the fundamental arguments for theism.
Wait, Lennox already got this much wrong, and this is just the introduction to his presentation? Looks like this is going to be a mini-series. Stay tuned for what I think is going to be part 2 of 4 of John Lennox and Stupid Arguments for God.